Amara Diarra stepped out of the black town car, her polished leather heels clicking softly against the cobblestone street. The city's luxury district buzzed with activity. Well-dressed patrons wandered in and out of designer stores, carrying bags adorned with iconic logos. For most, it was a typical sunny afternoon, spent indulging in high-end fashion, admiring the latest collections, and savoring the elegance that draped every window display. Amara had grown accustomed to the allure of these streets. Paris, Milan, New York, luxury districts were her domain. As one of the world's top fashion designers, she had long mastered the art of blending in, despite her extraordinary success. Today was no different. She wore a sleek, tailored, cream-colored trench coat, paired with dark sunglasses that hid most of her face. Her outfit was understated, yet spoke of quiet sophistication. A designer herself, she knew how to turn heads with minimal effort. But her visit today wasn't about being noticed. It was about finding inspiration. As she entered Luxe Moda, one of the most prestigious stores in the city, Amara breathed in the faint scent of leather and expensive perfumes. The store was meticulously arranged, each item positioned to exude elegance. Rows of handbags, shoes, and dresses crafted by renowned designers lined the walls and shelves. Everything gleamed under soft lighting that enhanced the opulence of the space. Amara's eyes drifted over to the limited edition handbags displayed in the center. These were the reason she had made the trip today. She had seen one of the designs featured in an exclusive Parisian magazine, and now, up close, she wanted to feel the texture, examine the stitching, and perhaps draw some creative inspiration for her next collection. She approached the display with the keen eye of a designer, running her fingers along the edge of the leather. The craftsmanship was impeccable, though a part of her couldn't help but critique certain details that could have been done better. Meanwhile, across the store, Martin, the store manager, watched her closely. From the moment Amara walked in, his gaze followed her every move. Dressed in a crisp gray suit, Martin prided himself on maintaining the utmost control over his establishment. He had worked in luxury retail for years, and believed he could spot the difference between serious customers and those who didn't belong. Today, something about Amara didn't sit right with him. She didn't fit the profile of the typical wealthy clientele who frequented Luxe Moda. Most came in draped in the most recognizable luxury brands, flaunting their wealth with every step. Amara, on the other hand, moved with a subtle confidence, and though her trench coat and heels were clearly of high quality, they weren't ostentatious or logo-driven. Martin's assumptions began to build as he noticed her carefully inspecting each item, not with the awe of a tourist, but with the practiced eye of someone who understood fashion intimately. He approached her, trying to suppress his growing unease. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted her, his tone professional but carrying a slight edge. "May I assist you with something?" Amara looked up, her expression neutral behind her sunglasses. "No, thank you," she said politely. "Just browsing for now." Martin nodded, but couldn't shake his discomfort. He hovered nearby, glancing at her every few moments, as though waiting for something to happen. In his mind, her behavior was suspicious. She hadn't asked for assistance, nor had she immediately gravitated toward the most expensive items in the store, like many of their affluent customers did. She was taking her time, carefully examining each item, her fingers trailing along the edges of handbags and shoes, as if assessing their value or quality. What Martin failed to realize was that Amara was doing exactly that, assessing the quality. Her entire career was built on an intimate understanding of materials, design, and craftsmanship. To her, these items weren't just luxury products. They were works of art, the culmination of hours of labor by designers, tailors, and artisans. She had spent years perfecting her own craft, drawing inspiration from such pieces and integrating them into her own vision. But none of this was apparent to Martin. His assumptions continued to spiral. He glanced at the security camera feed in the corner, focusing on Amara's every movement. Was she alone? Was she scouting the store for a larger plan? The manager's mind was clouded by years of unconscious bias and the subtle influence of a system that often profiled people who didn't fit into a narrow idea of wealth and status. Amara, unaware of the growing tension, continued browsing, picking up a small handbag that caught her eye. It was a black, crocodile-embossed leather piece with gold accents. She turned it over in her hands, admiring the meticulous stitching. Though she appreciated the design, she noted a flaw in the stitching on one of the seams, something that most wouldn't notice but stood out to her trained eye. She made a mental note of how she could improve a similar design in her own line. In the meantime, Martin's anxiety reached a peak. Unable to shake his assumptions, he retreated to the back office under the guise of checking inventory. Once inside, he pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yes, I'm calling from Lux Moda on 5th Avenue, he said quietly, his voice urgent. "There's a woman in the store, and I don't think she's supposed to be here. She's acting suspiciously. Could you send someone over to check it out?" As he hung up the phone, Martin felt a sense of control return. He had done what he thought was necessary to protect the store's reputation. Little did he know, this decision would soon unravel his carefully constructed world. Outside the back room, Amara continued her quiet exploration, unaware that her every move was being scrutinized. She picked up a second handbag, this one a rich burgundy color, and admired its sleek design. As she looked it over, she felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the world of fashion was ever evolving, and that her own designs had influenced countless pieces like the ones before her. She was in her element, drawing inspiration from the pieces around her, unaware of the storm that was brewing behind the scenes. The police would soon arrive, and what should have been a simple shopping trip would turn into a defining moment, not just for Amara, but for everyone involved. The quiet hum of Lux Moda was interrupted by the sound of footsteps as Martin made his way back to the showroom. He glanced at Amara from across the room, convinced that his instincts were right. While the store's elegant surroundings remained serene, a brewing tension quietly took root. As Amara continued to browse, unaware of the events unfolding behind her, Martin tried to appear as calm as possible, though a part of him grew increasingly anxious. The call to the authorities had already been placed, and now there was nothing more to do but wait. The minutes stretched on, each one feeding Martin's suspicions. His mind wandered into dangerous territory, imagining scenarios that had no basis in reality. What if she's part of a larger scheme, he thought. What if she's working with someone else outside the store waiting for her signal to strike? As these thoughts festered, Martin glanced at the other customers. A few were milling about, trying on scarves and admiring shoes, blissfully unaware of the internal storm brewing within him. He felt a knot of dread forming in his chest. He knew the luxury district wasn't immune to crime. There had been reports of high-end store thefts making headlines, and Martin was determined not to let Lux Moda become another statistic. Amara, meanwhile, remained absorbed in her own world. She picked up another item, a pair of shoes this time, admiring the craftsmanship and design. They were a deep emerald green with delicate, hand-sewn detailing that spoke of the skill behind their creation. She traced the intricate stitching with her fingertips, mentally cataloging the details that stood out to her, wondering how she could integrate similar elements into her next collection. She loved these moments, quiet, reflective, and full of possibility. As one of the top designers in the world, she knew that inspiration could come from anywhere, even the smallest detail in a luxury item that most people would overlook. But Amara didn't miss anything. Every seam, every cut, and every pattern was a potential source of creativity. And in a store like Lux Moda, she felt surrounded by artistry, albeit filtered through the lens of commercial fashion. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, pulling her momentarily out of her reverie. She checked the screen. An email from her team in Paris, a reminder of a design meeting for her upcoming runway show. Smiling, she quickly typed a response confirming her attendance, before tucking the phone away. Amara had no reason to believe anything was amiss, but she did sense a strange shift in the air. Perhaps it was the lingering gaze she felt behind her back, or the quiet murmurs that occasionally broke the silence. She shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing more than her heightened sensitivity in such a public setting. After all, she was used to being watched. In the world of fashion, she was no stranger to attention, though today she wasn't looking for it. But things were about to change. A few blocks away, a pair of patrol officers responded to the call from Lux Moda. They were used to responding to non-emergency situations like this, and most of the time, these calls ended up being false alarms. Nevertheless, they were trained to take every call seriously. Officer Daniels, a seasoned veteran, glanced over at his partner, Officer Rivera, as they made their way down the street. "What's the situation again?" Rivera asked, his voice casual as they approached the luxury district. "Store manager thinks there's a suspicious person browsing. Says she's acting weird, might be casing the place," Daniels replied, scrolling through the dispatch notes on his tablet. Rivera sighed. "It's always acting weird, isn't it? I swear, some people just don't know what to look for. Half the time it's nothing." Daniels nodded in agreement. "But we check it out anyway. Let's just see what's going on and clear it up." As they arrived at the store, the officers were greeted by Martin, who had been nervously watching the door. His expression shifted from tension to relief when he saw them. He quickly motioned them to follow him inside, his demeanor stiff as he explained the situation. "There's a woman inside. She's been here for a while, just browsing, but something feels off," Martin said in a hushed tone, careful not to alert the other customers. "I can't shake the feeling that she's not here to buy anything. She's been handling the merchandise a little too carefully, if you know what I mean." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You mean she's been looking closely at the items?" Martin hesitated, realizing how vague it sounded. "Well, yes, but it's more than that. I've seen this type of behavior before. It's like she's studying the products, planning something. I didn't want to take any chances." Rivera exchanged a quick glance with Daniels. They both knew the drill. It was their job to assess the situation without jumping to conclusions. The last thing they wanted was to escalate a misunderstanding. "All right," Daniels said, his tone calm and measured. "We'll talk to her. Where is she?" Martin pointed across the store, where Amara was now examining a display of accessories. The officers approached her slowly, their presence professional but non-threatening. Amara, absorbed in her thoughts, didn't notice them at first. It wasn't until she saw a reflection of their uniforms in the glass case in front of her that she realized something was happening. She turned around, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked up at the two officers standing before her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but puzzled. "Ma'am, we received a call from the store manager," Daniels began, his tone polite. "He mentioned that you've been here for a while and, well, he had some concerns. We just need to ask you a few questions." Amara's confusion deepened, though she kept her composure. "Concerns? I'm sorry. I don't understand. I'm just shopping." Rivera stepped in. "We understand, ma'am. This is just a routine check. Do you mind if we see some identification?" Amara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't a stranger to situations like this, being questioned in places where she was simply going about her day. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, handing them her ID without hesitation. As Daniels took it, his eyes scanned the name, Amara Diarra. Recognition flickered in his eyes, though he remained professional. "Miss Diarra, as in the fashion designer?" he asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. Amara nodded, her patience wearing thin. "Yes, I'm the creative director of my own label in Paris. Is there a problem here?" Daniels and Rivera exchanged a quick glance, both realizing the gravity of their mistake. But before they could respond, Martin, who had been watching the interaction from a distance, stepped forward. "What's going on? Is everything all right?" Martin asked, his voice tense, though he was still convinced that his instincts were right. Daniels handed Amara her ID back, his tone now more measured. "Miss Diarra, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. You're free to continue shopping. We apologize for the inconvenience." Amara's expression remained calm, but her eyes flicked toward Martin. The tension in the air was palpable, but Amara wasn't one to lose her composure. Not yet. The air in the store felt heavier, thick with the tension that had quietly brewed during the past few minutes. Amara stood still, processing what had just transpired. She had dealt with situations like this before. Subtle, sometimes not so subtle assumptions that led to uncomfortable confrontations. But this was different. This time she hadn't just been watched, the police had been called. Her patience, while deep, was wearing thin. Martin still hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation, despite the officer's sudden change in demeanor. His assumptions continued to color his perception, and even as he watched Amara calmly stand before him, he still felt the discomfort gnawing at him. "I just want to make sure there's no issue here," Martin said, stepping closer to the group. His words were careful, but the tone behind them suggested he was trying to justify his earlier actions. "You were in the store for a long time, and I wanted to be cautious." Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable behind her sunglasses. She knew how these situations played out, how quickly things could escalate if she responded with anger. She had learned over the years that restraint was a powerful tool. But today, she felt the weight of her restraint growing heavier. "Cautious," she repeated, her voice soft yet firm. She paused, as if letting the word linger in the air before continuing. "I've been in the store shopping, browsing, just like anyone else." She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were sharp and calculating but calm. "What exactly about that made you feel the need to call the police?" Martin faltered, realizing how absurd his reasoning sounded when spoken aloud. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the other customers, an older woman, approached the scene. She had been watching from a distance. Her curiosity piqued when the officers had entered. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice wavering slightly with confusion. "Is something wrong here?" Amara turned to face her, offering a polite smile. "No, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding." The woman looked at the police, then at Martin, and back to Amara, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. She glanced at the handbag still in Amara's hand, and suddenly recognized her. "Oh my goodness," the woman said, her eyes widening. "You're Amara Diarra, aren't you? The designer?" The room seemed to freeze for a moment. The revelation struck like a bell, ringing loudly in the now awkwardly quiet store. Amara nodded gently, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. The woman's excitement was palpable as she reached out, not to invade Amara's space, but in a gesture of awe and admiration. "I followed your work for years. You're absolutely brilliant," the woman gushed. "I saw your last show in Paris. The designs were breathtaking." Amara thanked her, her tone still measured, though she appreciated the recognition. The shift in the air was undeniable. As if on cue, more of the store's patrons began to whisper, some of them pulling out their phones to search Amara's name, piecing together the scene. Meanwhile, Martin's face had gone from slightly pale to full-blown mortification. He stood there, frozen, replaying the entire interaction in his mind, realizing now how he had made a terrible mistake. His initial judgment had been based on nothing but his own unconscious biases. He had called the police on one of the most famous names in the fashion world because she didn't fit the image he had of someone who belonged in his store. "Miss Diarra," Martin began, his voice shaky as he stepped closer, trying to recover from the embarrassment. I'm so sorry, I didn't realize who you were." Amara tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't need to realize who I was," she said, her voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. "That's the problem. It shouldn't have mattered." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The two officers, who had remained silent during this revelation, exchanged awkward glances, realizing there was no need for their presence. Daniels cleared his throat and looked at Amara. "Miss Diarra, we apologize for the inconvenience. It's clear this was a misunderstanding," he said, his tone respectful. "We'll be leaving now." Amara nodded politely at the officers. "Thank you," she said, her voice measured. "I understand you were just doing your job." The officers gave a curt nod to the manager before quietly exiting the store, leaving Martin standing there, still grappling with the weight of his actions. The other customers were now openly staring at him, some whispering among themselves, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Martin's world seemed to be crumbling around him. He was the manager of one of the most exclusive stores in the city, a job that demanded not just precision and attention to detail, but also the ability to manage high-profile clientele. And now, in one single moment of poor judgment, he had damaged the reputation of both himself and the store. Please," Martin stammered, his words clumsy as he attempted to make amends. "I truly didn't mean to offend you. I didn't know." Amara regarded him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. She wasn't a stranger to this type of situation, but it never became easier. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "It's not about knowing who I am," she began. her tone still firm, but not unkind. "It's about treating people with respect. It's about not assuming someone doesn't belong simply because of how they look." Martin nodded, his face red with shame. "You're absolutely right. I was wrong. There's no excuse for how I handled this." Amara sighed softly, knowing that the damage had been done. But she wasn't here to make an example out of him. She believed in accountability, but she also believed in moving forward. After all, this wasn't the first time she had been in a situation like this, and it wouldn't be the last. "I hope," she said, her voice softening just a little, "that this is a lesson you take to heart. For the next person who walks through these doors." Martin swallowed hard, nodding again. "I will. I promise." Amara looked around the store, noticing how the eyes of every patron were on her. She knew she could leave now, but something in her told her to stay, to reclaim this space on her own terms. So, she took a deep breath, offered Martin one last nod of acknowledgement, and turned back to the display she had been browsing before the whole incident unfolded. With renewed focus, Amara picked up a pair of shoes, sleek, minimal, perfectly designed. She ran her fingers along the fine stitching, allowing herself to settle back into her creative space. The moment had passed, and she wouldn't let it rob her of the joy she had come here to find. Martin, still standing awkwardly nearby, slowly backed away, giving her the space she needed. His mind raced, trying to figure out how he would explain this to his superiors, how he would salvage what had been tarnished in mere minutes. But for now, all he could do was watch as Amara, unshaken by the storm she had just endured, continued her quiet pursuit of inspiration. As the store's quiet atmosphere slowly returned, Martin found himself standing in the center of it, feeling the weight of his own actions. The police were gone, the tension had dissipated, and customers had resumed their browsing, though some still cast curious glances his way. The luxury boutique's elegant surroundings seemed to mock him now. The polished marble floors, gleaming with opulence, suddenly felt cold and unwelcoming. He was embarrassed. More than that, he was ashamed. His hasty judgment had turned what should have been a routine day into a scene that no one in his position ever wanted to face. Worse, he had not just offended any customer. He had insulted Amara Diarra, one of the most influential figures in the fashion world, the same world he worked in and admired from a distance. For years, Martin had prided himself on his ability to run the store smoothly, to cater to the elite with grace and charm, and to maintain the high standards Lux Moda was known for. He was careful, maybe too careful, about protecting the store's reputation, always striving to ensure that only the most qualified and affluent clientele graced its doors. But in trying to protect what he thought needed safeguarding, he had crossed a line, blinded by his own unconscious biases. He replayed the incident in his head, over and over, like a film reel he couldn't turn off. Amara had walked into the store with quiet confidence, an aura of elegance that any other day might have impressed him. But today, his assumptions had gotten in the way. She didn't fit the mold he had constructed in his mind of what an ideal customer looked like. Someone who would breeze in with a flurry of assistance and demand the finest items without a second thought. Instead, she had taken her time, carefully considering each piece, a behavior Martin had misinterpreted entirely. He had seen her as someone who didn't belong simply because of how she looked, and his snap decision to involve the authorities was the result. What made it worse was that, until Amara's identity was revealed, Martin hadn't questioned his assumptions. It wasn't until the older woman had recognized her, and the police had acknowledged their mistake, that Martin finally understood the magnitude of his error. The realization hit him like a wave of cold water. Martin glanced over at Amara, who was still browsing through the handbags, with a sense of calm that he could only admire. She hadn't lashed out. She hadn't raised her voice or demanded retribution. Instead, she had remained poised, her composure unshaken, even after being so gravely misjudged. Her quiet strength only deepened his sense of guilt. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair in frustration. His mind raced as he thought about what would happen next. Would Amara go public with the incident? Would Lux Moda be embroiled in a scandal, its pristine reputation tarnished because of his mistake? Martin felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the thought. He could imagine the headlines. Luxury store manager calls police on black fashion icon. Or racial profiling at high-end boutique. The store's name, and his own, could be ruined in an instant. He couldn't let that happen. Martin took a deep breath and began to think about how he could make amends. Though he knew no apology could fully undo the damage. He considered approaching Amara again, but each time he started to move toward her, he stopped himself. What could he say that wouldn't sound empty? How could he express the depth of his regret without coming off as insincere? For now, all he could do was stand back and observe, watching as Amara continued her exploration of the store, seemingly unaffected by the earlier events. The other customers had returned to their shopping, though Martin noticed that they were more subdued than before. He couldn't help but wonder what they thought of him now. Did they see him as a careful manager doing his job, or as someone who had let his own biases cloud his judgment? Judging by the occasional whispers and sidelong glances, he feared it was the latter. Meanwhile, Amara was lost in thought as she handled another piece from the collection, a sleek handbag, its surface smooth and polished, a testament to fine craftsmanship. She hadn't come here expecting this level of confrontation, but sadly, it wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. There had been countless other incidents, smaller and more subtle, but each time she had handled it with grace. It was a part of her reality, a truth she had long accepted but never embraced. As a black woman in the world of high fashion, Amara had faced her share of prejudice and doubt. Despite her fame and success, there were still moments when people saw her not as the accomplished designer she was, but as someone who didn't belong, someone to be questioned. And it wasn't just her appearance that triggered these reactions. It was the assumptions people made about her based on race, wealth, and status. But today had been different. The call to the police had stung more than she'd anticipated. Not because of the public nature of the confrontation, but because it reminded her of how fragile perceptions could be. Even in a store filled with her own influences, her designs reflected in the items around her, she had been seen as an outsider. Not a creator, not a visionary, but a stranger who was somehow out of place. Amara inhaled deeply, pushing away the familiar sting. She refused to let this moment define her day. She had faced much greater challenges, and had overcome them all with dignity. She wasn't about to let the ignorance of one man tarnish her spirit. But as much as she wanted to move on, there was something about Martin's actions that gnawed at her. It wasn't just the mistake, it was the systemic thinking behind it. She knew that for change to happen, these moments couldn't be left unaddressed. People like Martin needed to understand the consequences of their actions, not through punishment, but through reflection. It was the only way they would learn, the only way they would grow. After what seemed like an eternity, Martin finally gathered the courage to approach her once more. His steps were hesitant, his voice barely above a whisper as he stood at a respectful distance. "Miss Diarra," he began, his voice shaking slightly. I know I've already apologized, but I want to say again how deeply sorry I am. I acted on assumptions that were wrong, and I know that no apology can truly make up for that." Amara turned to face him, her eyes calm but piercing. She let him speak, sensing that he needed to get the words out. I didn't see you for who you are," Martin continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke from the heart. "And that's on me. It's not just about knowing your name or your work. It's about basic respect. It's about seeing every person who walks through those doors as someone who belongs, without question." Amara studied him for a moment, letting his words sink in. She could see the sincerity in his face, the regret that weighed on him. But she also knew that words, no matter how well-intentioned, were only the beginning. Action was what mattered. "I appreciate your apology," Amara said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through many battles. "But this is bigger than you and me. It's about the way we see each other, the assumptions we make before we even speak a word." Martin nodded, his eyes lowered in shame. "I understand." "I hope you do," Amara continued, her tone firm but not unkind. "Because it's not just about me. It's about every person who walks through these doors after me. This can't happen again." Martin swallowed hard, the gravity of her words settling deep within him. "It won't," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll make sure of it." Amara gave a small nod, satisfied for now, but aware that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, it would take effort, and it would take people like Martin learning from their mistakes, one moment at a time. As she turned back to the display, a quiet sense of resolution filled the space between them. Martin stood there for a moment longer, watching her with a newfound respect before quietly stepping away. He knew this wasn't the end of the conversation, but the beginning of something bigger. Something he needed to be a part of if he truly wanted to make amends. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street outside Lux Moda. Inside, the store's polished surfaces reflected the last warm rays of the day, creating a peaceful contrast to the tension that had filled the space just hours earlier. Amara, having finished her browsing, took one last look at the elegant pieces she had admired. Despite the unsettling events of the day, she had found moments of inspiration, small details she could incorporate into her own work. But more than that, she had left an impression, not through her fame or her status, but through her quiet, dignified handling of a situation that could have gone very differently. She approached the checkout counter, holding a handbag she had decided to purchase. The cashier, a young woman who had remained on the outskirts of the earlier scene, greeted Amara with nervous politeness, her eyes reflecting a mixture of awe and apology. Word had spread through the store about who Amara was, and it was clear that the employees were now more aware of the gravity of what had happened. "Thank you for your patience today, Miss Diarra," the cashier said quietly as she wrapped the handbag with delicate precision. I'm really sorry about earlier." Amara gave her a kind but measured smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, understanding that this young woman was also learning from what had happened. She didn't need to say more. The weight of the day's lesson was already evident in the girl's demeanor. As Amara left the store, she noticed Martin standing near the entrance, clearly waiting for her. His posture was less rigid than before, his expression less controlled, but there was still a humility about him that hadn't been there when the day began. He watched as she approached, his eyes filled with both regret and something deeper, an understanding. Amara stopped just before reaching the door, turning to face him one last time. Martin stepped forward, but this time his tone was softer, stripped of the defensiveness and authority that had marked his earlier interactions. "Miss Diarra," he said, his voice carrying the same sincerity he had shown before. "I know I've already apologized, but I wanted to thank you as well, for your patience, for how you handled everything today. I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. This isn't just about what happened between us. It's about how we see each other, how we can do better, how I can do better." Amara looked at him for a long moment, letting his words settle. There was something different in his voice now, an acknowledgement that went beyond simple regret. It was the beginning of change, not just in how he viewed her, but in how he would approach his job and the people who walked through the doors of Lux Moda in the future. "People don't change overnight," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But what matters is that you're willing to see things differently, to do better next time. I hope you take that seriously, because it's not just about me, it's about everyone who comes after." Martin nodded, his face earnest. "I will. I promise you that." There was a moment of quiet between them, filled not with tension but with mutual understanding. Amara knew that Martin still had much to learn, but she also knew that this moment could be the catalyst for something better. He had been humbled by his own actions, and that humility would serve as the foundation for his growth. Amara gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before turning toward the door. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her, a welcome change from the controlled environment of the store. The city's streets were still bustling, but Amara walked with a sense of calm and purpose. She had come to Lux Moda to find inspiration for her work, but she had left with something far more meaningful. As she walked down the street, her thoughts drifted back to the countless times she had been in situations like this, moments where her success and talent were overshadowed by the assumptions others made about her. She had learned, over the years, that while she couldn't control how people saw her, She could control how she responded. And today, she had once again chosen dignity and grace over anger and frustration. It was a choice she made often, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. It was how she survived, how she thrived, in a world that often tried to define her by her appearance rather than her achievements. Behind her, the store's gleaming windows reflected the last light of the day. Inside, Martin watched as she disappeared into the evening crowd, feeling the weight of the lessons she had imparted. He wasn't the same man who had made the call to the police just hours earlier. He had been forced to confront his own biases, to see how his quick judgments could hurt someone who deserved nothing but respect. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but it was one that he knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Amara walked, she let go of the frustration that had initially filled her. She knew that this was just one moment in a long line of experiences that had shaped her, but it wasn't a moment she would dwell on. Instead, she focused on what lay ahead, the designs she would create, the shows she would orchestrate, the lives she would touch with her art. Fashion, for her, was more than just clothing. It was a form of expression, a way of telling a story. And today, her story had taken on a new layer of meaning, one that would influence her work in ways she hadn't yet fully realized. By the time Amara reached her car, the city's lights had begun to twinkle, reflecting off the glass buildings that towered above. She slid into the back seat, placing the handbag she had purchased next to her. As the car pulled away from the curb, she gazed out the window, watching the world pass by in a blur of lights and motion. In that moment, Amara felt a quiet sense of resolve. She knew that the challenges she faced as a black woman in the fashion industry weren't going away anytime soon. But she also knew that she had the power to change perceptions, not just through her designs, but through how she lived her life. Today had been proof of that. She had faced prejudice, but she hadn't let it define her. She had turned a moment of ignorance into an opportunity for growth, not just for herself, but for Martin and everyone who had witnessed what had happened. As the car continued to glide through the city streets, Amara smiled to herself. The unseen thread of understanding that had been woven between her and Martin would remain, a reminder of the power of empathy and the importance of seeing people for who they truly were beyond the surface. And with that thought, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever came next with the same strength and grace that had carried her through today.